Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to this other presentation of the think tank, La Fabrique de l'Exportation. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. So we have a pleasure tonight to have with us our guest speaker, Lasse Torkelli, which is from Associate Professor at the LUT University. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. A very interesting topic tonight. It has to do with the internationalization issues of service SMEs. And so Lasse will share with us his findings and insights that would certainly be very useful to other researchers and obviously for companies that are in this sector of activity. So without any further ado, I would like to turn it over to Lasse, and Lasse might decide also to further maybe introduce himself. Lasse, so the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Good evening on my part as well. And welcome to this session. Glad to see you here. My name is Lasse Torkkeli and I come from LUT University. And LUT comes from Lappeenranta-Lahti University of Technology. So I'm now physically sitting about the halfway point between Helsinki and St. Petersburg. So we are a smallish university in size, right next to the Russian border, but still on the Finnish side. And good to see you all here. I see a couple of familiar faces. So I think Ulrika, at least we met in scientific communities before. But just to give a brief background information. So Lappeenranta, smallish city, about 70,000 people. A university which has both technical and business school departments, or we call them schools. We have about 5,000 students and about 1,000 faculty. So in terms of the global scale, maybe we are not the biggest business school in the world, but we do pack a punch. So for instance, in the Times Higher Education recent ranking, it ranked LUT University Business School as one of the top 200 business schools in the world. So that was a nice recognition. And a bit about my background. So I defended my doctoral thesis about 8 years ago. And it's not a surprise that it was on SME internationalization. And I have always been, I've done research with different methods, but the guiding question has always been for me, what determines the extent of success in internationalizing SMEs. So I mostly favored quantitative studies for that purpose. So look at different capabilities and networks. How do they affect the degree of internationalization that SMEs can achieve? How does it affect their international performance? How does it affect their growth in turnover or profitability, for instance? So that is my my background in brief. And I made a slide before I get to the main brief of the presentation. I made one slide addition to the slide set that I sent you guys before. So I added my email address there. So in case after we've done tonight, so in case you want to have further discussion, have some questions or comments, feel free to be in touch with me via email. And with that out of the way, I would go to the topic, which is the specific challenges of service SMEs internationalization. I would give you a bit of a teaser in terms of what we refer to here. When we talk about SME internationalization, it's my experience that we actually oftentimes talk about SME exporting. So of course, internationalization can include different types of foreign operation modes, also for foreign direct investment. But there is surprisingly little large-scale research on SMEs operation modes and changes of operation modes for this purpose, because typically if we collect, for instance, large-scale data on internationalizing SMEs, I would say about 80 or 90%, depending on the national context, of course, but the large majority of them, they start with exporting and they stay with exporting. So actually there's not that much changes, and there are some parallel streams of research on, for instance, on so-called micro multinationals, which is a specific type of small firm that actually goes into foreign direct investment straight away. And this is critical because service SMEs actually if you think about it, you do not export services the same way that you oftentimes that you explore the traditional products and the goods-based businesses do. So that's the first clue. The second is that we usually, when we do research on SME internationalization, and if we look at, for instance, what types of capabilities are linked to increased performance or increased profitability or increased turnover in internationalization, what kinds of networks are linked to better internationalization, what kinds of resources, for instance, are linked to better internationalization, we do include the industry. So we want to have achieved generalizable results, and so therefore we usually when we collect data which we then analyze, we usually do so in a cross-industry way. So this is both service SMEs and manufacturing SMEs. And then to account for that, we actually insert in our quantitative models the so-called dummy variables. So we code service SMEs as, for instance, as 0 and manufacturing ones as 1, and then we include the data model. And what that enables us to see is that if we have a finding, for instance, that if you are an SME that wants to internationalize successfully, you should prioritize certain types of capability development, for instance. Is that generalizable across all kinds of SMEs? Or is it actually so that how strong that relationship is and how strong the finding, does it actually depend on the industry context? Does it depend on whether you are a manufacturing service SME? And I took a look at all of the studies that we've done related to this, and I found that in about half of the cases, actually, this is significant. So it means that in about half of the cases, we cannot say that, you know, if we find that some aspect of SME operations leads to better internationalization, that is...
Excuse me, Lasse,
yes.
Are you still on the first? Because we only see a thing we see is your first slide.
Yes, this is the one
okay.
with the...
Okay, that's the introduction. Okay, yes. Very well.
So that is a kind of a teaser to our topic, which is to say that there is, we do know in science and in business and international entrepreneurship and international business research, we know quite a lot actually on SME internationalization, but we haven't focused that much on you know, what is the role of services in that, and is it generalizable to service industry sectors as well. So the structure of the presentation, we will look at these dilemmas in more detail according to these points that I wanted to outline in a similar way that we included also in the flyer, so it adheres to what was advertised, so to say. So first we'll take a short look at what makes this service internationalization distinct. Why can't we say that everything we know about SME internationalization, that it actually is generalizable across service and manufacturing industries? Then we look at the trade-off decisions that are specific to SME internationalization in the service context. Then a couple of words about how COVID-19 pandemic is impacting on internationalization of services. We have done some research on this in Finland that will be published soon, for instance. And then I will look at consider some potential managerial recommendations if you want to foster SME internationalization from an SME management point of view, and also policy recommendations that could be used to foster service SME internationalization at the local or regional or national level. So this is the starting point of our discussion. The main tenets, without going into detail on the actual theories, is that how we see SME internationalization traditionally from research perspective is that the argument has been that companies are risk averse and they really don't want to internationalize in general. And they want, when they do, they want to look at the markets that are closed, that they feel that they know well, and they want to escalate with gradually intensifying commitments. So they would start with maybe with sporadic exports, then providing certain types of other type of export that is more systematic, and then maybe from there go to foreign direct investment. So step by step, avoiding too many risks. And oftentimes to physically close markets, but the key point there is that company management wants to internationalize to those markets where it feels that it understands the local culture and how the market.
once again, sorry about that, Lasse. It appears that we don't see the slides that you're discussing.
Okay.
Maybe if you could just now, it's not on the display mode. If you put it in display mode, maybe you will. Do we have who's taking care of the slides? Okay, now at least we can see the slides.
Okay, so do you see now the
slide? Yeah,
internationalization maintenance? Yes?
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, we can see them.
Okay, so it considered risk covers. Now, since the 1990s, of course, there have been several developments related to also to service SME internationalization, very much rise of the internet, rise of the digital startups, digital businesses, advancing globalization, more efficient travel and logistics costs. And actually, it is one of the cases where the management in the consulting industry has consulted the scientific community in the sense because McKinsey & Company coined the term born globals in the early 1990s, which underlies a lot of the SME internationalization research that has been done. So born globals are considered these new types of startups that look to internationalize rapidly straight after their inception. No risk averseness, but rather try to dominate globally very soon after foundation. But the thing is that recently there have been more criticism in the sense that the most SMEs are in fact not born globals still, regardless of how global we want to think ourselves, but most SMEs tend to be risk averse still in the internationalization, tend to operate regionally. So rather than have a large number of SMEs, or service SMEs that have global operations, they operate in several markets, for instance, within the EU region with the same kind of rule set. And then they still tend to engage in exporting modes only. So this is the rough guide on SME internationalization and background and literature. Now, then can you see now the next slide? So this is the service SME internationalization. Yes. By SMEs, just a brief clarification. There are different definitions, but it generally means independent organization that employs less than 250 people. So this is what I refer to when I refer to SMEs. There are different national definitions, and European Commission also has a definition which includes balance sheet and turnover thresholds. But by and large, this is what we're talking about with SMEs. And the service SMEs, when compared to the larger companies, is critical also that they are distinguished by the entrepreneurial orientation, which is the organizational culture and tendency within the organization for risk-taking, proactive and innovative behavior. And it is actually the entrepreneurial orientation that underlies much of the SME internationalization and entrepreneurial internationalization research. So the idea would be that these type of companies are more successful in actually seeking internationalization and then achieving it. And then referring to our recent research that we did, we actually found that in the service SME context, entrepreneurial orientation, it can underlie both advanced internationalization as well as increased service innovation in SMEs, but in different mechanisms. So this is one aspect that makes it distinct compared to larger companies, and also perhaps in comparison to other type of SMEs. So entrepreneurial orientation underlying both internationalization and service innovation. And then the next one is that, okay, we know that also from recent research that SME internationalization from traditional manufacturing sectors, to what we know, is not always applicable to service SME internationalization, as I mentioned. So we are not the only people to notice it. And how is it actually different compared to SME internationalization from more traditional industries? That most of the services cannot be exported in this traditional sense. So if we find that most SMEs engage in exporting and exporting only, but then by the nature of the services, the service SMEs cannot follow the same kind of guidelines, they cannot follow the same kind of strategies to international markets than traditional SMEs favoring exporting can do. So this is the first issue, and it means that they need to oftentimes to internationalize with more risky operation modes of foreign direct investments, requiring more risk, more resources, more commitment, which all can be issues with small firms that have usually have comparatively less resources. And the entry mode choices, according to research, are driven by the nature of the services, the intangibility, inseparability, perishability, and heterogeneity, which characterize the service business overall. And also the impossibility to hold inventories can provide challenges to internationalization. I mean that the best practices found in SME internationalization from manufacturing sectors, which oftentimes relate to SME exporting, are not by themselves necessarily applicable to the service SME context. Instead, it is important that the service SMEs use reputation as a signal to develop legitimacy in foreign markets. So actually the role of the brand and the reputation as such is heightened even more. And I'm not going to go into detail on different types of service SMEs, but just to point out that there are different types of research on different types of service SMEs. So professional service firms, internationalization, such as law firms and management consulting, it has its own stream of research that has not permeated the internationalization research as much, but it is out there in terms of management literature, just to point out. But in terms of the service SME internationalization, the role of the culture and institution in host markets is even more important. And also digitalization of value chain activities can be much more straightforward for service SMEs than many manufacturing SMEs. And this is, if you consider the present ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, this can be quite big, because to the extent that you are able to digitalize different parts of your value chain on demand, that to that extent you may be able to avert some kind of unforeseen shocks to global supply chains or delivery issues. So that in brief is some background on what makes it distinct. Then we look at the trade-off decisions. Of course, SMEs in general oftentimes are faced with trade-offs in internationalization because they have limited resources, and then the traditional discussion between, where do we put our eggs? Do we put them to internationalization, or do we put them to innovate our product or our service more? That can be an issue, but especially as we have found in our studies, and I put there several other studies there that shows you in a way how recent this service SME internationalization literature that really starts to look at these things is. It comes from mainly from 2018 to 2020. So this is very recent to actually bring the services to the forefront of the research like this. So service SMEs have to choose between internationalization of service innovation. This has been the finding of other scholars, and also we found this kind of result. So it's found that each type of innovation affects internationalization differently, and specifically that if you are a service SME and you engage in service innovation, then that does not have a very good synergy on internationalization. So actually, being a service company that aims to do service innovation, that can backfire in terms of the company trying to internationalize. So this is one specific aspect where the service SMEs have to make some trade-offs oftentimes. And then the second is, of course, the need to balance the entrepreneurial orientation, especially the risk-taking orientation, with firm survival. So if you look at the role of entrepreneurial orientation, in some ways you could say that it always is more beneficial to have more of it. So there usually isn't a threshold where being proactive can backfire the company in terms of internationalization, or being innovative can backfire. But definitely with risk-taking, there are many studies have found this inverted U-shaped curve, that being more risk-taking benefits your company. If you're an entrepreneurial company, you want to internationalize a small company to a point. And then, of course, if you take too much risk, unnecessary risk, at some point, there will be a negative feedback on that. So these are the main trade-offs. And this is just to show you an example from our study. So just to kind of point out, so on the left side, you see different aspects of entrepreneurial orientation and different types of skills or human capital, and how they lead in service SMEs to service innovation or internationalization. So DOI refers to degree of internationalization. How widely and how intensely has the company been able to widen its international operations? So this is, I think, a very clear picture in the sense that you can see that there's different arrows going to different outcomes. So it is one type of orientation that leads to innovation, but then the other type of orientation actually leads to internationalization. So it really is a trade-off. And if you see it, for instance, that if your company exhibits innovativeness type of entrepreneurial orientation, that can, maybe not surprisingly, that can lead to a very positive effect on the extent of service innovation that you do. But it seems actually that it has a negative effect on how well you are able to internationalize. So that there's a negative effect from innovativeness to degree of internationalization. And then also we found that internationalization has in service context, the more wider you are internationalizing, the bigger hit you can take in profitability. So this is to point out that there do exist these specific trade-offs, and you may have to, especially in the service SME context, there may be quite a sharp trade-off between, do you need to innovate or internationalize? And the one implication here would be that to the extent that you can avoid innovating during the time when you should be internationalizing your service SME, that will benefit you. So if you have the type of innovation and type of business model that is scalable across markets, then that can give you kind of double boost in terms of internationalizing your company, because then you don't have to innovate or adapt your services that much according to each target market, which then can put an SME into a kind of a bind in this purpose as well.
I have a question, last, please.
Yep.
Yeah, are there only SMEs in the sample?
This one, yes.
SMEs only. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we make this point. I mean, it's a bit of a stereotype, but in Finland we have Nokia and Kone, and then pretty much all of the other companies are SMEs. So by default, if you think about where does the SME internationalization literature comes from, where are the main countries where you see this kind of research? I think it's not a surprise that it tends to be small open economies such as Finland, Ireland, New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, because to the extent that your company is growth oriented and high technology intensive, so niche oriented, and you have a small domestic market, that means that internationalization becomes very soon the de facto way to actually grow your company. So I think this is one distinction that may be even between Finland and France, for instance, but definitely you compare to USA or China, other huge markets, is that growth options for your SME, they may require internationalization sooner or later based on your home markets, and in Nordic countries especially, that is quite soon. So from that perspective also, I suppose it's not a surprise that a lot of the research on SME internationalization, it's been done on the Nordic and small open economies context. So this one is ours, is quite naturally of Finnish SMEs. Some of the other samples that we've used have come from countries such as Colombia, Estonia, and Bangladesh. So we have some comparative aspect, but of course, by no means would I claim that this would be universal. So of course, to some extent also the size of the home market may impact, especially the SME growth options. What other growth options does an SME have in addition to entering foreign markets? And of course, the size of the home market has a big role in that. So did that answer your question? Okay, good. Then moving on to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So of course, if you look at service SMEs, one size doesn't fit all. So digital startup can be considered as service SME. To a certain extent also some hospitality industries which are actually more viewed as traditional, more kind of places where the service encounter requires personal contact, which of course has a big impact on whether or not the COVID pandemic really affects you or not. So broadly speaking, what we have found is that digitally enabled services, so you think about digital startups, online startups, for instance, their biggest problems at this point seems to be hiding their joy, because this has been a boon to many of them in terms of growing their customer base and growing their business. And many of them have actually had these digitally scalable business models that have been kind of waiting for something to happen in the external environment, which forces people more to the digital world. And of course, this is a case where many of them don't want to be too joyful, because of course the pandemic is not a joyful event, but by many estimates and research that we've done in Finnish SMEs especially, this has been a huge opportunity for growing the customer base and thus the network effects for digitally enabled service SMEs. Then of course those services that require personal contact, this has been a huge threat or even a business killer, and in them the survival has depended on I would say on their business model innovation capabilities. So how capable they are in developing their business model in a way that does not require personal service contact in terms of delivering the service. And from that also the digitally enabled companies have been able to form new kinds of partnerships. I have an example in a minute about that. So certain types of service entrepreneurship, such as food deliveries, have actually been highly aided by the arrival of the pandemic. So I would say that the dividing line is the capability to move to, first of all, to have your business model digitally enabled, and second of all, to, when if need be, to be able to be resilient in a way that you are able to innovate your business model in terms of service delivery quickly from the physical encounter base to the digital one. And international operating service SMEs, if you compare to manufacturing SMEs, may be more shielded from these global supply issues. So now there are news about issues in, for instance, on the microchip delivery, and we see that everywhere. I'm operating with the old laptop simply because we have to wait for the new laptops to arrive because there have been delays because of the pandemic. And it is interesting, it seems, based on our research, that international operations are seen by service SMEs as real options to mitigate the impact of pandemic restrictions. So what this means is that they are saying that, okay, we are operating in 5 or 10 different markets, so we're kind of following where the coronavirus is on the upswing and downswing, and where it looks like things are returning to normal, we actually are able to increase our presence and put our resources to grow our business in that market. And then for this other market, which seems that it's actually a situation it's getting worse, we may be able to divest from that. So paradoxically, it seems that for some service SMEs that are operating internationally, the pandemic gives kind of sense of control, more of a sense of control than domestic service SMEs, because they're able to kind of mix and match on different markets and kind of react based on the expected market development based on the news of the pandemic advance. And we also found in our study that is now hopefully published soon, is that the service SMEs with the most international orientation and outlook face the least pressure for internal changes due to the pandemic. So this is was quite interesting to us. So the more international the service SMEs were, the less they on average had to make internal changes within their corporate structure and ways of doing business, or ways of running meetings or laying off people. So that is of the outline. There are a couple of quotes here which we don't need to get into detail with, but we noted that some pointed out that competition has become more aggressive because service SMEs in certain industries, by default, they see the pandemic and moving to digital world more as an opportunity. Some companies have totally moved the marketing to digital marketing from offline to online marketing. And also the contingency planning has been an important part of operations. Of course, you can say that the contingency planning should start before a pandemic hits, but it is definitely has been a core of some of the service SMEs that, by our estimation at least, have not been the hardest hit, or have managed to actually weather the storm and to find new sources of revenue. A couple of examples. So you may or may not heard of Volt, which is a food delivery business founded in Finland by the head of the Slush entrepreneurship event. It was actually founded quite many years ago. It was 2014 in Finland, and I think it's not a surprise that when the pandemic hit, the market for food deliveries from restaurants to individual people's home exploded. And this is one example of a company that has very much, service SME that has very much benefited from the restrictions. So Financial Times last year ranked the companies with the most growth in Europe, and Volt here was number 2 on that list. Number 1 was a fintech company from UK, but that tells you something about the kind of the opportunities that that pandemic such as this can bring, because the restaurants in Finland also and in many other parts of the world, in Europe, this company now operates in 20 countries in Europe. To my knowledge, not yet in France, but they will try this, so you will see it in any case. They quickly approached the restaurants when the restaurants in Finland as well were closed, and they offered the service that we'll handle your deliveries. You can sell your food to people via delivery, even if you had to keep the restaurant closed. We will handle it. We will take a premium of the price, and for some, let's say, negotiating power on the high-end type of companies such as McDonald's, I think they lowered a little bit the premium, but that's the business model for them basically. Their platform model, so the kind of Volt delivery people, they operate under a very similar premise as Uber operates with Uber drivers. So they have closed about 500 millions of investments recently, and one of the fastest growing companies in Europe. Of course, they're not the only one, and with this type of service SME, its internationalization is much about becoming the dominant designer, becoming the preferred brand. So there are different competitors, even in Europe. For instance, in UK, there's a company called Deliveroo, which is also has been doing quite well. So, and France might actually be one of the kind of their battlegrounds for them to see which company prevails in terms of becoming the global standard. That to give you an example. Another example is GoStars, which is actually, I wanted to mention this because this is founded by our business and technical school alumni some 5 years ago. It's an image sharing service that is developed for semi-professional photographers to be a marketplace of selling their photographs directly to buyers, whether that's consumers, users, or companies. And that is also a company that basically, when the pandemic hit, it seems that they received a lot of new customer base, and they really didn't have to change their business model. So this one of the companies said that it's really pandemic hasn't hit us at all. So the digital aspect, or providing the type of service that enables people that is not dependent on the physical contact, and also enables those service companies that are relying on that to kind of get around certain types of restrictions. Those have been the type of companies that have, seem to have very much prevailed. Then we come at the end to what kind of managerial and policy recommendations we could give based on this research and based on my understanding. So first of all, as I mentioned, it's not given that just because you have some studies that we have found that some aspects underlie successful internationalization of manufacturing SMEs, you cannot always rely, if you're a manager of service SME, that these best practices will also work for your company. So you have to be very careful in trusting these managerial implications, managerial recommendations based on that. Then the decision to internationalize from service SME perspective should only be done after the thorough risk analysis and reputation development in the target markets. So again, it's the role of the brand and the reputation and the legitimacy of the service SME is of crucial importance, especially in service SME internationalization. Also, developing alternative contingency plans is very important. I'd like to say that, or kind of make the argument that it's not so necessarily that as a service SME you would have to make contingency plans to avoid another, in case another pandemic hits, because the pandemic is very much, or to some extent, a black swan type of event. So, but rather, I would say that it would benefit the service SMEs to engage in contingency planning and finding out where the crucial weaknesses in terms of the critical parts of our business operations and delivery of our services, where do they lie, and how do we make those aspects anti-fragile in a way. Because if you think back, for instance, to the financial crisis and some 10 years ago, and when all the news seemed to be about Lehman Brothers and the banks for several months. So, okay, if you as a company then developed contingency plans in terms of another financial crisis, well, that might not necessarily help you that much in this pandemic, because there are different types of shock and it affects different types of businesses and in different ways. So rather than look for specific events for contingency plans, I think it would benefit the services SMEs especially to kind of look at the service delivery across the business operations and to pinpoint the critical aspects and to develop contingency plans based on those. Also, as we know, that innovation and internationalization are determined by different types of resources for service SMEs. We found this interesting result from Finnish SMEs in hiring employment decisions in terms of service SMEs, looking to internationalize and innovate, prioritizing skills and know-how rather than employees' creativity and innovativeness seems to be paramount. So in one way, you would of course want everything, but if you have to choose, you would choose the boring expert rather than the creative learner, which is always not always the kind of the main default necessarily. And then 50, the intense expansion of international scale and scope, which is the degree of internationalization. How many countries do you operate in? What share of turnover comes foreign markets in your company? Is in a way it's poison for profitability of service SMEs. So, and therefore, regionally focused stepwise, careful internationalization strategy is recommended unless there are significant slack resources available. And this is where I go back to this Volt example. So if you get 500 million of investment from venture capitalists, then I think that the regionally focused stepwise strategy might not be beneficial, and definitely your investors will not be happy about it. But we are talking up here about the typical service SME, which is considered to be resource constrained, as small firms are, and have to think carefully where they prioritize their resource assessments. And finally, a couple of policy recommendations to foster service internationalization in SMEs. I would recommend that post-pandemic governments and institutions should return to the standard viability metrics and principles in terms of how does the public and the public institutions, how do you provide support for SMEs in general. So at least in Finland, we noticed that there was a big chunk of government funding to unviable businesses that definitely were not growing, definitely were not internationalizing, and actually might have gone bankrupt in a couple of years. But because of COVID-19 onset, it was pushed, the kind of the governmental support in terms of financing was pushed through the Finnish business landscape. And therefore, this is very inefficient way if you want to foster growth entrepreneurship or international entrepreneurship, which is oftentimes is a kind of this a goal of the governments and public decision makers is to make efficient use of taxpayers' funding. Also, I would recommend to focus support on non-born digitals. So Born Digital is a company by definition that is able to move large parts of their value chain to digital forms straight from inception. So those kind of companies by default, first of all, they might not be hit as hard by such a pandemic. And these type of companies, Born Digitals, tend to be the darlings of investment funding because of their oftentimes large global potential and huge growth ambitions and in terms of growing the company and becoming truly global companies. So in that sense, maybe they are not at the forefront of public support because they may be having a much easier access to private funding as well. And the services focus to support the service SMEs, which are kind of forced to prioritize profitability. So these traditional more cash-strapped SMEs that, for instance, do have international potential, do have growth potential, but are not for some reason as enticing to private funding or venture capital funding or other types of competitive funding from that perspective. And then look to facilitate networking and joint international opportunity development between global brands and service SMEs wherever possible. So I call it legitimacy piggybacking. So what it implies is that that SMEs, if they usually, at least in the developed world, they tend to be high technology oriented compared to, let's say, more developing world SMEs. So usually it is not the technical novelty that is the issue, and especially in high-tech industries, sometimes the marketing aspect or the marketing resources that underlie it. So actually, it's easy to say that service SMEs should engage in reputation building, brand building, but the question is, where do you take the resources? And I think the existing global brands, putting them together with service SMEs that try to find commonalities which would cause them to do business together and to engage in brand building together would be beneficial. We have noticed that many SMEs, especially the smaller ones, the owners are very conscious about, a little bit careful about this because they want to protect their legacy in a way, and their own brand. The service SME are careful about being swallowed by the global brand. But from public policy perspective, this would be recommended. Finally, would recommend to increase resourcing for service innovation specifically to this support to complement the more traditional export assistance instruments that almost all of the countries in the world have in some aspect or another. Because if you only prioritize export assistance and do not take into account supporting service innovation at all, then of course from internationalization service SME perspective, this can result in misguided funding in the sense, because if they don't engage in exporting, then they might be out of requirements for this type of assistance, but then actually they don't get the kind of assistance that they would definitely need to increase the international operations, which would be the other side of the trade-off line, which is the innovation part. So prioritizing also to some extent help for service SMEs on their service innovation might be one way to facilitate service SME internationalization also. So there you go. Thank you for attention. And I was roughly on time, maybe a little bit over time, but we had some issues with the slides, so maybe we will allow that. So any questions, any comments, any discussions is of course.
Thanks, Lasse. Thank you very much for this, for your insights for this presentation. Maybe to summarize, in terms of takeaways for a service SME, can we say that, is it fair to say that in a few words, it's prioritization, it's dealing with the trade-offs you mentioned, flexibility or versatility, scalability, what else can we say? Digitalization?
Contingency planning, I would say that ensuring the service delivery, the critical parts of the service delivery process for any kind of exogenous job. So I'm doubtful. So to what extent are we able to predict where the next crisis, what the next crisis will be like? So is it the financial crisis or pandemic? Which one it is? So people often talk about this resiliency and contingency planning, but planning for specific events may be very inefficient because if we could predict that, then we would all be very rich.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much once again, Lasse, and thanks to all the attendants for your participation.